So thanks everyone for joining our session today, which is all about API first and shifting our focus from UIs to offering value more holistically. So my name is Frank Kilcommins. I'm Principal API Technical Evangelist here at SmartBear and delighted to be joined by my colleague Nauman Ali. Nauman, want to say hello to everybody?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I'm Nauman, like Frank said. I'm one of the product managers here for the API lifecycle. Look
Great.
forward.
Thanks, Nauman. So just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get going. Today's session is being recorded. Everyone who's registered will get an email with a link to be able to watch the video on demand. If you do have questions throughout today's session, feel free to use the Q&A box either at the bottom or the top of your Zoom window. You can feel free to use the chat box as well. Tell us where you're joining from today, and we'll have plenty of time to answer as many questions as possible towards the end. There'll be a couple of polls popping up now and again as we're progressing through the slideware and the demo, just to capture your feedback on certain topics that we're interested in. So looking at the agenda today, what we're going to do first is zoom out a little bit and look at kind of some of the larger trends that are happening across the API market. We'll then look at how they're manifesting themselves or causing challenges for API providers and consumers. And then we'll explore the concept of API first and seeing if that gives us a mechanism or a methodology to help overcome some of those challenges. So we'll take you through the what and the why of API first. We'll look at some of the drivers that you may notice within your organization that may give you some insight or some let's say, hints that your organization could be ready or could benefit from adopting an API first approach. And then we'll cover the benefits as well. And this might give you some useful mechanisms to try and metric your journey towards API first. We'll touch on as well some kind of common concerns or pushbacks that we often see and hear about when it comes to adopting an API first approach. And then we'll look at what we're doing with regards to building visual tooling to help reduce the barrier to participation when it comes to delivering APIs. So APIs have evolved from just technical art, both business stakeholders and technical stakeholders to be able to participate. I think a poll is going to pop up right now just to kind of try to understand where you're feeling some friction across your API delivery processes in today's climate. So moving on to the trends. So what we're seeing kind of more commonly or more prominently across the API landscape in 2024 is that everybody is producing more APIs. So we're having this term API sprawl becoming more prevalent. So we're all building more APIs across our organizations, and many of those APIs are not following, let's say, the ideal processes and therefore are not being cataloged accordingly and or have very limited documentation associated to them. That causes us many challenges with regards to being able to understand what APIs we have within our organization, as well as potential security issues as we start exposing more of our surface area towards the real world. We're also dealing in what we call a multi-gateway and multi-style landscape. So over the last maybe 10 years, maybe the dominant style has been RESTful, but we need to also fully understand and embrace the other flavors of APIs and realize that it's not a one size fits all or a silver bullet approach. So REST is still absolutely the best style to use for certain scenarios, but we need to make sure we don't fall victim to the law of instrument, and we need to apply the right style for the right type of API problem we're trying to solve. We're also seeing that the API technical landscape is also evolving. So there's more specifications being released. Therefore, there's more, let's say, skills that are needed within our practitioner teams. And many organizations are also being dragged to deliver APIs from a regulatory requirements perspective. And therefore, they're being mandated to deliver the APIs. And again, they need the skill sets within their teams in order to understand how they can deliver those effectively. We are now also living in a post-pandemic era, so we're all more distributed than ever. And that incurs also collaboration challenges when it comes to delivering APIs. So we need to make sure that we have the right tool sets in place to facilitate that distributed nature within our technical and product teams, and making sure that we don't fall victim to API management oversights that might slip between the cracks. So these trends that we're seeing are causing certain challenges for the provider teams, but also for those of us that are consuming APIs. And kind of one of the top things that we're noticing is that when we're rushing to try to deliver APIs even more quickly than ever, that is incurring quality challenges or quality issues with regards to the APIs that we're deploying. The net result of that is that it means we're spending more of our precious human resources on actually trying to remediate and troubleshoot those APIs. If we're releasing poor quality APIs into production, it's also causing us impacts on the business and commercial side of our operation. So we're potentially incurring reputational damage that might lead to us actually losing customers where they will move on to APIs that are provided by another provider and of higher quality. What we're also seeing is that it's very natural for us to want to be able to leverage APIs from other parts of the organization and or even third-party APIs. So we can focus on what we're trying to deliver as a provider team and leverage the capabilities of others as APIs to speed up our own delivery cycle. So what we're seeing is that the majority of engineering teams are both API consumers and API providers. And when we put that hat on as an API consumer, what are we expecting of an API that's being provided to us in 2024? And what we're really seeing is that ease of use and accurate and detailed documentation are the top attributes that we're expecting to help elevate that developer experience. So if we're in the process of delivering APIs, we need to make sure that we are taking care of the usability of APIs as well as the documentation. And I'm putting a special emphasis on usability and accurate and detailed documentation because there are many qualitative research papers out there, and I'm happy to share some of these with anyone after the talk that are showing really how API usability is related to API longevity, and longevity is one of the main traits of a successful API. You want your API to be out there for a long time, you want it to be easy to use, and you want lots of people to use it, and that will only happen if it's actually easy to use and easy to understand. So as we saw on the previous slide, the majority of teams are producing and consuming APIs, and the majority of teams have stated what their expectations are when it comes to consuming APIs and the traits of those APIs or what their expectations are. But unfortunately, we're seeing that there's a bit of an alignment gap. So even though teams are aware of the importance of usability and the importance of API documentation, what we're actually seeing is that only 48% are confident that their APIs are, in fact, well documented, and only about 43% are unsure that they have the processes in place to help them deliver appropriate developer experience. So it's easy for teams to understand what good looks like, but it's not so easy for us to be able to implement good consistently. And that brings us on to API first. So can API first as a methodology help us actually achieve those usability goals when it comes to the APIs, help us deliver good API documentation, which will ultimately elevate the developer experience. And hopefully that will lead to a place where our APIs are adopted and they're long living artifacts serving value for our business. Now, I often think before we jump straight into what API first is as an approach, we often need to kind of recalibrate our mental model when it comes to what an API actually is. So when we think about what an API is, of course, we get pulled immediately back into the technical world. So it stands for Application Programming Interface. And of course, APIs are indeed the language of software, and it's what enables two independent software components to be able to communicate and exchange value. But I often like to refer to the jobs to be done theory, which is a customer-centric approach popularized by a guy called Clayton Christensen in books like The Innovator's Dilemma. And that's really kind of thinking about APIs being there in order to help us solve business problems. And of course, the majority of business problems are actually, in many ways, people problems. So thinking a little bit about what APIs are with that kind of framing in mind, we can now see that APIs are not just solely technical interfaces. They help us expose digital products in a way that's ready to be embedded to deliver those capabilities into new experiences. So it's not just going to be serving our own proprietary UIs. But if we think about these bigger ecosystems and bigger marketplaces, like in the financial services setting, we have embedded finance. So we want to be able to embed our capabilities into the experiences provided by others, and therefore APIs give us a mechanism to do that. So if we think about kind of that people problem and how it relates to the business side of the house, are there more potentially appropriate acronyms that we could use if we wanted to change the meaning of APIs? And again, this is all about helping the more technical stakeholders in an organization have more fruitful conversations around API strategy when it comes to the business stakeholders in an organization. And some of these acronyms I've kind of discussed with many people across the API community over the last year or two. And some of them that kind of always keep bubbling to the top are allow people interact. So of course that means that APIs give us the mechanism so that people within different teams within our organization or even in different organizations can start communicating and exchanging value in a digital form. They're also all people inclusive. So regardless of our background, they're equally business assets as technical assets, and they're not biased around what kind of technology stack we have stood up within our particular organization. They also allow participants innovate. So they can enable us to stop reinventing the wheel. So we can discover what capabilities already exist within our organization, and we can build on top of them and create new business models. And of course, it goes without saying, they allow us to access our products interoperably. So with that kind of framing in mind and thinking a little bit more holistically about APIs as being not purely technical artifacts, what is an API first approach? Well, it's quite a simple construct, and it really means that what we should do when it comes to building out our digital capabilities is focus on seeing the capabilities as APIs or sets of APIs first and foremost. And then that will lead us to a scenario where we have API sets or APIs that are exposing our capabilities, so at the boundaries of our capabilities, making them available to other parts of our organization or indeed outside of our organization. So ultimately, we're making them available to teams of developers and or machines, especially with the AI world that we're moving into. And that will allow us to fuel new waves of innovation and interoperability. And ultimately, it's all about delivering better and differentiating business to customer experiences and business to business experiences. So what are the principles of API first if we want to adopt such an approach? Well, fundamentally, it's about thinking about the API as the prominent deliverable that we're going to focus on. And this is before the UI or the channel that we're immediately thinking about, maybe from a proprietary product perspective. And that is counterintuitive to us kind of going in this traditional, perhaps deluded state of building modern digital applications and assuming that there is no strong need for interconnection or integration between those software components, because every piece of software that we build in 2024 needs connectivity in some shape or form. So UIs, of course, can be relevant, but they are not the sole channel that we should be thinking about when it comes to embedding the capability. And I always like to think of the API as the first UI that we should be serving for when it comes to our deliverables. So an API is an interaction point for developers of other teams to start consuming the capabilities that we're offering. We then need to make sure that the APIs are discussed, aligned, and positioned properly within our architecture upfront, and then affording us the time to do thoughtful design before just rushing into prototyping and implementation. So of course, by designing and building APIs before other aspects of the software, we can have a more efficient, scalable, and flexible system that will be easily integratable out of the box, and we won't have an integration after type of situation. And then when it comes to thinking about the design before the implementation, we need to think about the consumer's perspective. and avoid falling victim to what is known as the provider syndrome. So what I mean by that is when API providers have a deep domain experience and deep focus on their own internal domain model, it will more than often result in API designs that are easy to deliver, but offer a very poor consumer experience. So what we need to do is we need to flip that on its head, and we need to focus on delivering APIs that are easy to use rather than APIs that are easy to deliver. And that's a very important kind of discussion point or friction point when it comes to prioritization, of course, because from a business, from a product perspective, we want to release something as quickly as possible. But again, we always need to be cognizant that we need to release something that's easy to consume, not necessarily easy for us to just build and deploy. We then need to, again, going back to kind of the jobs to be done principle, if we can build out use case specific data structures that enable the consumer to get their jobs to be done, then we're greatly going to reduce their time or mean time to integration. So they can get up and running with the API as quickly as possible. And then, of course, we need to cater for and understand the importance of developer experience. So we should be using things like API specifications, which will bring a lot of affordances to the API consumer and making sure that they can understand how the API works and can play with the API without having to do any heavy lifting from a code implementation perspective. And this is all about, acknowledging that the developers are indeed people as well, and they'll have specific needs, skill sets and preferences, and we need to be as consumer centric as possible to that regard. So before we move on, Nauman, is there any questions popping in that you'd
Yes.
like to answer?
Yeah, Frank, so we have a couple of questions for you around the API first approach. So one of the first ones is, can the API first approach be an architectural principle, like when designing complex systems, like let's say a microservices-based system?
Yes, it can. I think, making sure that there's buy-in from an architectural perspective to set up more or less like the platform or the governance area for how teams need to operate and need to apply API first as a principle goes a long way to making sure that it can be practically executed as a strategy. So you need to make sure that the standards are in place to enable the teams to be able to deliver good APIs consistently. So, do you have a picture of what good looks like for your organization? Do the different teams understand why you're building an API for a particular problem? And are you providing them the tools, the patterns, and the support that they need to be able to adopt an API first approach?
Yeah, thank you, Fran. And a follow-up to another question around the same idea, I think you answered some of it, is when you're starting something greenfield or from scratch, like a microservice, what can we do to convince people to do an API first? Like, what are some of the strategies you could potentially use to make sure people are convinced?
I think we'll actually might cover that in the next slide. So it's kind of the next slide that we'll be moving on to, which I can, and I'm happy to like park it at any point and come back and dive more into that question, Nauman. But a lot of it is, okay, how can we convince the business or the organization and the different groups that are within an organization that, hey, we might benefit from moving towards an API first approach? I think often it comes to being able to recognize what are some of the drivers, both on the organizational business side as well as the maybe operations and technical side, that might indicate that now we are ready to start seriously considering API first as part of our fundamental strategy for delivering capabilities. And this is what we try to cover in this slide. It's not an exhaustive list by any way, shape, or form. These are just things that I've experienced myself. So often if there's a need or a desire for the business to be able to reach new customers and markets. So again, thinking about markets that are not maybe part of your proprietary control. So you're not relying on footfall coming into your proprietary mobile applications or web portals, but you want to start participating in other markets that are controlled outside of your organization. Maybe you also have a desire to improve customer experience or your net promoter score from an organizational perspective. There's a desire to be omni-channel. So you want the provider teams exposing the capabilities to make that available for the teams who are responsible for building mobile apps or web portals, or even to your B2B partners. So you want to expose those capabilities without, reinventing the wheel for every different consumer. There's a desire to be adaptable for changing market conditions. So again, thinking about, all of the AI hype that's around us right now, if you want to make your capabilities available to particular AI agents, how can you do that if you do not have the concept of exposing those capabilities seamlessly as or through APIs? And potentially you're identifying opportunities for direct revenue. So again, that could be embedding your capabilities into other marketplaces like embedded finance, or maybe you have a strong need for partner integrations where you can provide your services out to your broader partner network, and that can be embedded into their solutions. You have a want or a need to increase product stickiness. So maybe you have products that come in UI form and other forms, but you also want to expose those capabilities as APIs so that they can be embedded into the CI/CD flows of your customers, ultimately making your product and your service more sticky within your customer base. You might also be mandated to get into the API game from a regulatory perspective. So think of open banking, think of other healthcare and telco standards that are now becoming regulated, and there are forcing providers to expose APIs in certain ways, ultimately to improve the competitive landscape for consumers and end users. You might also, from an architectural perspective, and this kind of touches on one of the questions, you might want to have better management of your business and capability domains and build up and understand, maybe from a business architecture perspective, how the interactions are happening across the different departments or groups within your organization. And ultimately, you want to strive or see a need to become more efficient and have better communication and collaboration between the business side of the organization and the technical side of the organization. Maybe then more on the operational and technical drivers. Maybe you want to start moving from monolithic applications within your organization to microservice based, or at least, let's say, monoliths, at least. Again, there can be architectural shifts to move towards more composability, so that you're not starting everything greenfield, that you can start building different layers within your organization that are consuming capabilities from other parts of the organization more quickly. There's a desire to remove domain complexity for your customers. So again, you need to be striving to not let your domain knowledge bleed into solutions that you're exposing out to your customers. You want to improve API quality and the non-functional requirements that are related to your APIs around, security, scalability, usability, and so on and so forth. You want to improve integration project success. So, we've all been there. We have different solutions or different applications within our technical landscape, and we have a need to integrate them. And something that should be very easy and thought about from the get-go becomes a project and a big effort in and of itself if we haven't thought about that interoperability from the start. And that will lead us to also a desire to improve the dependency insight between teams. So as soon as we have applications that are integrated together, if we are working incrementally and delivering new features, we want to make sure that we can fully understand the dependencies that are there from a planning perspective. And that also leads to the desire to reduce siloed inconsistency. So can we enforce and enable teams to deliver independently but yet consistently with regards to some of the more quality-based attributes of APIs? And if we do so, then hopefully we will also have API consumers that cross organizational or domain boundaries. We will enable that type of capability. And it also, which I think is often overlooked, gives us an ability to have a controlled way to address technology debt. So if you think of two applications that are integrated in some way, shape, or form, if there's a very clear contract on that integration point or on that API, then the provider is safe to completely rip and replace their technical stack as long as they can hold true to that contract that they're exposing and providing to their upstream consumers. And that's often overlooked. If you do a good job at setting out the interface, that should free you up from being tied to the implementation. And the consumer should never care about what type of technology is behind that interface. It should be completely opaque. And if you see these drivers, and then if you start to mature and implement an API first type of approach, then hopefully, or the expectation is that it will start leading to certain benefits that align with these business and operational drivers. So we can start seeing that we should be expecting a more adaptable and innovative delivery culture within the org because we have better insight and discoverability across those capabilities. That can increase our speed to market for building out new models or new capabilities there on top. We will have improved consistency and descriptiveness. So it'll be very, very clear as to how to consume capabilities and expose capabilities. That should lead to better cross-team collaboration. And ultimately, for the consumer perspective, the consumer experience will improve. That leads us also to having better visibility and observability as to how value is being exchanged across the domains or capabilities within our org. And then especially when the value starts leaving our organizational boundary. Again, we will fully understand how we want to package and productize that value offering and make it available for external consumers. And that will lead us to having a clearer operating model for APIs. And hopefully we can always tie that to strategic goals. It's not API for API's sake. It's APIs realizing that the majority of businesses are now digital businesses in some shape or form. So understanding that APIs are a fundamental component in order for us to achieve that digital transformation. And if we can do this and we have a clearer, discoverable overview of our capabilities as an organization, and the business side and the technical side understand that the API is the primary mechanism for exposing that value, then that should lead us to having a higher level of understanding of APIs, not just being a technical artifact, but being socio-technical, and that will lead us to having better alignment across business and technical teams. And then just to briefly touch on the operational and technical benefits, you will have better developer experience when it comes to consuming your APIs. They will be well documented. Usability should be at the fore. There should be transparent API standards management. So again, this is where the architecture groups can play a very pivotal role in ensuring that they enable governance across the org. And I always say it should be governance with a small g, and it should be governance as an enabler rather than an impediment for the engineering teams. If we do that well and we have automated ways of validating that we're doing things consistently, we will have higher quality of APIs. And when I talked about, the traditional challenge of the integration-based projects, I don't think there should be integration-only projects because we should assume that every software that we're building needs interoperability from the get-go. And that will ultimately allow us to address what's often traditionally the weakest link, and that's where there's integration handoffs between different systems. If we do so, then consumers will be able to ingest the value much, much quicker, and that will enable them to have a faster time to market. We should have ways to be able to measure the API program, of course, and KPIs for measuring success need to mature along with the API program as well. But if we have a standard way of doing these things, we also have more flexibility from an organizational perspective within the technical team. So we become more flexible in nature. So it's easier for engineers and testers to move from one team to another because we have some consistency with regards to how we deliver and expose these APIs. And it's all really around making sure that we have proper separation of concerns and realizing then that API contracts can free us from having a tight coupling between the implementation and the actual representation of that value towards consumers. And that gives us a proven mechanism to tackle technology debt head on. I'm not sure, it might be a good point to stop for a few questions now before we move to some of the common pushbacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have one question, Frank, which is around can you describe more what is provider syndrome?
Sure. So provider syndrome basically means that you constrain yourself as a provider team by fully focusing on your domain knowledge. So you start falling victim to a situation where you're letting domain specific taxonomy bleed into your APIs that you're exposing. And that will make it harder for consumers to understand what this API is about. When it comes to delivering an API really is intended for the consumers. So you need to strive to understand what problem your consumers are trying to solve and what is the best delivery mechanism and API style to solve that problem in the most effective way for the consumer, and put the emphasis on making sure that the API is easy to consume and weighing that much greater than making sure that the API is easy to deliver. So what I always say is that we should never pass the responsibility onto a consumer for something that we could have done ourselves as a provider. So if a consumer has to make a convoluted sequence of calls, for example, to achieve their job to be done, we should have be thinking about that from a consumer perspective from the start and seeing what's the most efficient and elegant mechanism for consumers to extract the value that we're offering from our capability. So it might be very, very easy to expose those three endpoints from a provider team because maybe that's the way the system is architected, but that's not going to be the nicest way for the consumer to interact with it. And they're paying the price for our legacy architecture. And that's something that we always have to be mindful of. And that's often what's kind of coined as the provider syndrome. You just rush to start. Again, in the most extreme case now, man, it'd be like, hey, well, we have a database. Let's just expose the APIs conforming to the database schema. Um, and from a consumer perspective, nobody wants that, but that will also incur a very tight coupling between the API consumers and our internal data structure. And that will make it very hard for us to manage technology debt into the future as well.
And I feel like once this domain knowledge starts bleeding into APIs, it also starts showing into, even if you have a UI product, like that also starts bleeding into that edge, and you'll start seeing those terminologies come up there too. So just and that makes it for a bad user experience in both terms.
Yeah, like there's a lot of layers to it. Like if that domain knowledge and it's very specific and it's not very well understood by the consumers starts bleeding into the APIs, what you often will find is that puts more pressure on the provider team because there will be more support and burden put on the team because consumers will not be sure how to interact with the API in the most effective way. There'll be more questions, more tickets, more potential client issues that will be coming in, and that will be hindering the provider team from actually doing what they want to do, which is new stuff and not necessarily continue to support the old stuff. That's often kind of also called the glass box challenge, where folks will come to the person who knows how the things work, because they can kind of see into that domain knowledge and they know how it works, and they're not able to self-serve. And what we want to make sure is that the APIs that we're providing also really cater for that developer experience from an onboarding and self-service perspective, so that a developer should be able to grok and understand what they need to do purely from the API documentation, and they shouldn't have to reach out to the provider team to find out how things work.
Sure. All right. So I know you talked about some of the measurements for API programs. So I think that's an interesting topic. What are generally some KPIs that you recommend look at? Like, let's say you're taking up API first. This is what you would want to see improving, and some of those things that you should really take a look at to convince your business stakeholders this is working.
Um, like I think they will definitely mature as you mature through your API program. I think initially starting off, you want to keep things simple, so you probably want to be able to record the number of APIs that you're exposing that are maybe meeting the minimum set of what of criteria that you define for what good looks like, and you should be striving to increase that number over time. It's probably a good idea to understand the number of consumers that you then have for these APIs so that you're bringing them to market effectively and people are getting value from them. Keeping track of simple things like the ratio of successful calls versus maybe back-end server issues versus client issues is also kind of a good measurement to keep track of, because if you see lots of client issues, so kind of let's say 400 series types of errors happening if we're talking about HTTP based APIs, that can indicate to you that, okay, maybe consumers are struggling with being able to consume the APIs in the right way. Do we have problems with our API documentation that we could be improving here? Do we need to add more examples to help overcome that challenge? If you have the mechanisms to record kind of the onboarding time, and that's also, incredibly powerful. And that's something that's also very, very interesting from a business perspective and from, let's say, a CX perspective when it comes to really tracking customer satisfaction. So as soon as somebody registers for your API portal, for example, the clock starts ticking effectively, and then how long until they make their first API call versus how long until they actually get keys to make a production API call. So there are different things that you can also track. As you mature, then you will have maybe monetization things that you will also be recording. But as I said, you shouldn't boil the ocean. That's the most important thing. Pick the 3 to 4 KPIs that are most relevant. Agree that with the business stakeholders. Ultimately, they should be driven by what's important for the business, and then move on and recalibrate half annually on are these accurate, or do we need to kind of tweak the key results.
That makes sense. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of more questions, or should we leave it for the end?
I don't mind. We can go through the next slide. So there's kind of one more slide in this section, and then we'll start moving more into demo and showing some of the cool visual tools that can reduce the barrier to participation. So the next slide is kind of just covering at a very high level some of the pushback that we've experienced over time with regards to API first adoption. And often it's like people think about API first as this big design upfront effort. And it's not. Like that's the first thing I will say. It's not. Like what you're thinking about, akin to any other type of software delivery, is okay, what is the minimal viable capability that we're building here that's going to add value for the consumers? And that's what we focus on. You're not trying to design for all eventualities. You want to make sure that you just design enough, but you follow recommended practices around extensibility to make sure that you can evolve the API safely over time. And then, of course, you use API standards and specifications, and you use mechanisms for making sure that you can guarantee backwards compatibility, and you have good communication hygiene with your consumers with regards to how they should deal with API changes over time. A lot of the pushback related to this is people start thinking about API first and they automatically think, hey, we're going to be swamped with having to deal with formats like YAML, like JSON, like OpenAPI, like Async API, and that's not what we do. We just want to start coding and start releasing some stuff. But what we're saying is that if you really think about the shape of the API first, and you do it in a standard mechanism that will afford you an ability to benefit from the rich tooling ecosystem that's out there, both on the open source side and across tons of vendors. This is not just about SmartBear. There are so many tools out there that adopt the standards, and that makes it better for everybody who's participating, because we get flexibility and we get resilience in our tool suite, so we can swap in and out different tools because we're building things on top of the standards. And again, it's like there is this big rush in many teams. We feel it ourselves now, and here, at SmartBear as well, where we have SaaS products. The SaaS products fundamentally are used interactively through the user interface. And there can be this misconception that the UI is the product, but it's actually the capabilities under the hood that kind of formulate the product. And the UI is just one of the consumption channels that the actual capabilities are manifested through. We also have the APIs themselves. The APIs serve the UI, they serve CLI, they serve CI/CD processes. So it's just thinking that it's all of these can be concerns, but it's being confident enough that we can showcase that there are more benefits that outweigh these types of concerns. And it's not about stopping developers from developing. It's far from it. It's making sure that they develop the right thing from the start. And we're limiting the amount of rework or feedback late in the process, which is harder to deal with than getting feedback earlier in the process. Like if we're working on a design, as I say, an error in a design can be solved with an eraser. An error on production basically needs a sledgehammer. You have to redeploy more software to fix it. And I think with that, Nauman, I will hand over to you, or we can take a couple of more questions, but I know you want to kind of showcase what we're doing to improve multi-stakeholder collaboration. And again, dealing with one of those big pushbacks that people have to deal with YAML and JSON and OpenAPI and all of these formats.
So I think we can take one more question that's more related to the provider syndrome answer that you gave, which is how do we dig out of that hole? And I know we'll answer some of that by thinking of the use cases first, all that. But like if you have anything to add there.
Just so I understand, the question is how can we get out of the provider syndrome type of mentality?
Yeah, if it's already there. So
yeah, I think a lot of it is you can work with your architecture group to define a picture of what good looks like. Part of what good looks like from an API perspective is like setting up your style guides and your governance rules with regards to if we're building an API, it should conform to this picture of good. Making sure that we can enable the team. So if you have an architectural group who takes responsibility and a passion in governance and enabling the teams, they should work with the product and the engineering teams to fully make them aware of the standards, provide them with some of the tools, and give support in API design reviews even. And that's a very good touch point to catch and capture where maybe taxonomy or different internal orientated attributes are bleeding into the API. And again, if you are putting some effort into crafting that design up front, it means that you can catch those things before any code is written, before anything is theoretically exposed towards the consumer. And you can also circulate it as part of, feedback loops to different stakeholders. So you can get feedback from consumers. Do you understand the terminology that we're using here? Is there anything for you that's a little bit opaque or not clear? They're just some kind of practical tips, but a lot of it can be supported through automation with, validating that standards are being met with regards to the shape of good APIs, but you can't omit human review processes as well. We need to make sure that there are like API design reviews that are built into the process to make sure that we're not letting some of that taxonomy bleed in. So with that, Nauman, I will hand over to you.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you, Frank. And just continuing the conversation on how to make it easy for people to get started with API first. And like we've talked about, one of the most important pieces of that is designing first. So you think of the API design first rather than getting to code. You think of the shape of the API. And one of the pushbacks that Frank mentioned was JSON or YAML. So while Swagger Hub, other vendors, there are good editors out there that help you a lot writing open APIs, but with new versions coming in, new features coming in, people who are not that used to open API also wanting to design and review APIs, there's always some a level of effort that's required to get open API or even async API. These formats written, they're important, but writing them is not the easiest sometimes. So we have introduced form editor. You might, if some of you have used Stoplight at one point, you might be familiar with this UI. We brought that into Swagger Hub, so you still have the code editor, which is great for people who are already used to Open API. But then if you want to get started with some of the UI stuff here, you have a JSON schema editor. You can define your schemas. You can easily switch between both of these views. And I'll show more of this in the demo. But yeah, that's what we're going to get to.
Great. Okay, so we can move over to the demo. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand over to Nauman. I think another poll will just pop up while we are just performing the switch. So you can take over now, Nauman.
Yes. All right. So perfect. So hopefully you all can see the familiar Swagger Hub UI. So I'll start with API, designing an API and what has changed there. So if I go into an API, if I have a new one, I'm starting with it. You'll see the familiar code editing capabilities here, which you can use to write YAML. All of that is still there. But when you look on the top right here, there's a form view option now. And what that does is takes away some of that YAML in JSON and converts that into this hopefully nice form UI, where from things like, let's say you're writing your API overview or your endpoints, creating new paths or editing existing ones, you can do all that. I'll start off with my favorite part of this form editor, which is the JSON schema editor. So let's say you're starting with schemas. You can create JSON schemas, create new ones by a new model here, or if you have an existing one, you can add new fields to it. So let's say I'm adding a new field to this to the schema itself. You can create these properties, and if I click into here, so writing schemas is probably not too hard. Like you can define a type, define a name. But what we have seen people tend to miss, especially when they're coming new to Open API or JSON schema, is some of these other properties, which are really important in defining a good contract and eventually good documentation, which is like you should put in a format, and like putting this right out there instead of people having to figure out how you define these helps adopt it more. You can define regex patterns, minimum length, maximum length. So all of that is right there for you to start defining. So richer contracts are hopefully one of the things. Even if you use Open API a lot, you just it's easier to put in these details in here. Then if you go into the component section, you can also this also tends to improve reuse, because you see all those models that you can link right here, right? So let's say I already have an existing model that I want to use. I can go on and start using that. It'll start showing up. It's easier to navigate through it. Now, if I want to go and edit this one, I can go in here and start editing that too. So the JSON schema editor provides you with all those capabilities that you can put in there. There's also documentation, another important piece of it, where you can put in Markdown. There's nice little helper tools to write good Markdown in here for your descriptions, or even if you're writing them on the top level. So that's the JSON schema editor. And then if I go into endpoints here, I can edit things like general overviews, like, again, the Markdown editor here, put in descriptions, define a security, define any X extensions, parameters, see pretty easily if there are any query parameters defined, cookies defined, headers defined, or add them. And another nice thing about this is that it works well with some of the existing things that Swagger Hub has. So let's say you have some of your domains, which are shared models defined already. What you can do is, if you go into components, you'll see that you see models from this project, but you'll also see models coming in from your domain. So let's say I already have an existing error model. I can choose that. It'll be dereferenced here, so you know what you're using. And it'll keep updating the preview as we do that. So that's primarily what the form editor can do. And you don't need to necessarily switch to the form editor. So let's say if I'm making a change here and I go into code, that should show up right then and then. So this is all in sync. So you can keep working in your code view while go to the form view whenever you think it's the more useful tool to use. You can use it to design APIs, but you can also do the same for your domain model. So let's say you're creating reusable specs or reusable schemas or parameters across that you want to use across your organization. You can do the same thing with the form editor. Hopefully creating some of these schemas or some of these request bodies is easier with the UI now. And you can do the same thing for templates itself too. And you have all the other things like the preview right there. Please give us feedback in the chat or share it later, but or if you haven't used it already, go try it out. But that's primarily what I wanted to show for the form editor. If you have questions.
And I think what you were showing there, Nauman, and we can go into a little bit more depth on it, but these also really enhance some of the challenges that we talked about. I know there were a couple of questions on the provider syndrome and how to overcome it. And so with the concept of API templates, you can define the shape of a boilerplate API. And so this is like a kickstart then for every team who wants to create an API, and it can have a lot of the cross-cutting concerns or consistency concerns already addressed. So then it's really just about filling in the specific endpoints and or descriptions that are applicable for the use case at hand that you're trying to solve for. And then when it comes to the domain models, so they are reusable. So it allows us to kind of build it and define it once and then reuse it across multiple APIs. And that goes a very long way to also preventing that taxonomy or incorrect taxonomy bleeding into different APIs. And it also helps address kind of schema sprawl where we have, many variants of the same object surfacing across different APIs because it wasn't easy for a particular engineering team to find that model already existed or was already defined. So we can define the models that we want to leave a particular business capability within our organization. And then we can make sure that they are used by the APIs that will be served at that boundary level into a capability so that we may have internal models that we use in APIs that are consumed only by systems within a particular domain, but we're making sure that APIs that we're exposing outside of that domain buy in and use the models that have been defined to make sure that provider-based taxonomy isn't bleeding in to APIs that are leaving that boundary point. So that's kind of a tactic to apply, and domains give a very, very useful mechanism to govern that whole process.
And just to thank you, Frank. And just to add to that, I think domains, templates, and then these standardization rules, some of these that you can define in Swagger Hub, these also help a lot. So if you have some of these rules defined, anybody who's coming in designing APIs using the form or the code view would still get these errors. So that if they're using something that shouldn't be really going out, they'd get these automated messages rather than having to manually review it, which can easily be missed. So.
Absolutely.
Do we have any other questions, or should we move on to the?
I am seeing. So there was a feature from Palav. Is this feature already live? I can't see that for the APIs for my APIs in Swagger Hub. So maybe you could just give some overview, Nauman, as to where it becomes available and kind of maybe at what plan level.
Yes, so this is available on all paid plans. It is available on production. One catch today is that it is available for OpenAPI 3.0. So if you're still on Swagger 2, move to OpenAPI 3 potentially. That's just the latest format, but it's not available for OpenAPI 3.1 either. But that is something that we're looking to get into the form editor soon. So we started off with the one that was the most adopted one, but we'll get to other versions. There are other things that we want to get to add more features to the form editor too. So if you have any requests or anything that you want to add there, please let us know. That's always helpful feedback.
Okay, great. And there was a question from Chris if we could provide links to guides that can be used to convince the business that API first approaches is the right way to go. So yeah, definitely we can put together some of those and share them with you. We'll also make the slides from today's session available as well, so that folks can download them if that helps.
All right, so if those are the questions, I think one last thing to cover here is that some of the tools that you're seeing, like the standardization piece there, a lot of our other tooling, like the editor, all of this is built on open source. Some of these you might already be familiar with, like Swagger, SOAP UI Packed, but the tools that have come in from Stoplight, like Spectral, Prism, Elements, we continue to add those capabilities into our commercial offering, and we continue to maintain these open source tools and invest in them because they build our product and they're much loved by our customers too. So our open source commitment is right there. Anything you want to add there, Frank?
No, I think you covered it. I think that's really it. It's, having these capabilities at the core, and then obviously our commercial products build on top and address higher level concerns, like collaboration across teams, like enforcing standards across multiple teams, etc. But we still will continue to completely invest in our open source offerings as well. And more participation is always welcome.
All right, awesome. So I know we're pretty much right at the hour, but if there are any more questions to take, you have a few minutes to leave them here.
I think that is pretty much it. I don't see any new questions coming in. So thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully you got some value from today's session. As a reminder, the recording and the slideware will be shared with you after the fact. That will probably go out later today or tomorrow. So thanks everyone for your attendance, Nauman. Thanks very much for joining me today.